Ann Judson, Missionary Life for Burma. Sharon James. Appendix 1. Anne's Legacy. What had Anne's life achieved? First of all, she and her husband Adoniram had been used to pioneer a church-planting work in Burma. They had not been the first missionaries there. The prayers and labors of Felix Carey and others had gone before, but they were the first missionaries to stay there. All previous missionaries had either left or entered government service. They also had the privilege of seeing the first Burmese people converted and of establishing the first church. From the start, Anne had felt the same missionary call as her husband and worked alongside him as co-laborer. She was fully engaged in teaching, personal work in the Ziyat, and she engaged in translation work in both Burmese and Siamese. The catechism she translated became a vital tool in instructing young converts. None of Anne's own children lived beyond the toddler stage, but many of the Burmese converts regarded her as their spiritual mother. Secondly, humanly speaking, it was only because of her tireless efforts during the war that Adoniram's life was preserved. He not only survived, but was subsequently able to work in Burma for the further 23 years, during which time a firm foundation for church life was laid in Burma. Patrick Johnstone, the author of Operation World, observes that the missionary zeal of the Baptist Church in Burma today still reflects something of the spirit of the Judsons. Thirdly, Anne's writings were among the first to stir up missionary interest at a popular level among the Protestant population of both America and the United Kingdom. Her account of the American Baptist mission to the Burman Empire was widely read. She also provided spirited contributions for missionary magazines, which aimed to produce a reaction on the part of her readers. For example, she wrote the following lines for the Missionary Magazine of 1818. Let those who plead the native innocence and purity of heathen nations visit Burma. The system of religion here has no power over the heart or restraint on the passions. Though it forbids, on pain of many years' suffering in hell, theft and falsehood, yet I presume to say there is not a single Burman in the country who, if he had a good opportunity, without danger of detection, would hesitate to do either. Though the religion inculcates benevolence, tenderness, forgiveness of injuries, and love of enemies, though it forbids sensuality, love of pleasure, and attachment to worldly objects, yet it is destitute of power to produce the former or to subdue the latter. It is votaries. In short, the Burmese system of religion is like an alabaster image, perfect and beautiful in all its parts, but destitute of life. Besides being destitute of life, it provides no atonement for sin. Here also the gospel triumphs over this and every other religion in the world. Fourthly, she was a passionate advocate of female education. All proceeds from her account were to be plowed back into the schools for girls in Burma. On her first arrival in India, she had been tremendously impressed with the girls' school at Sedamapur, run by Hannah Marshman. She wrote home at that time, "Good female schools are extremely needed in this country. I hope no missionary will ever come out here without a wife, as she, in her sphere, can be equally useful with her husband. I presume Mrs. Marshman does more good in her school than half the ministers in America." This subject was treated at greater length in Anne's address to females in America relative to the situation of heathen females in the East, written in 1822. At the time of her death, Anne had already started a girls' school in Amherst. The next year, Adoniram wrote that there were 15 girls in the native female boarding school, and that Mrs. Wade taught them for 7.5 hours a day. The school moved to Moulmein in November of 1827. Mrs. Wade continued to take in girls from backgrounds of terrible poverty and suffering, including some slaves. Her description of one little girl is included to give some identification of why Anne felt so passionately the need for money to redeem slaves. The child was a slave of 7 years old, and some residents of Moulmein told the missionary she was likely to die because of vicious treatment from her master. Adoniram went to the owner and threatened that if he did not hand the girl over to the mission, he would be reported to the English magistrate. Mrs. Wade wrote her little body was wasted to a skeleton, covered head to foot with the marks of a large rattan, the blows from sharp-edged things, which left deep scars. Her forehead, one of her ears, and a finger were still suffering from these blows, and did not heal for some time. Her master, in a rage, one day caught her by the arm, gave it such a twist as to break the bone. Besides, she had large and very dreadful burn upon her body, recently inflicted. Of this last horrid deed, delicacy forbids my attempting any description. After nursing her with unremittent care by day and night myself for 2 weeks, I had the inexpressible satisfaction of seeing her begin to play with little girls. Thus, those who had responded to Anne's appeal to sponsor female orphans and redeem slaves were assured that this work was continuing. Fifthly, her life and death became an inspiration to a whole generation of American Christians. The memoir was printed in 1829, ran through many editions. There is no way of telling how many people it influenced. For example, Anne was the childhood heroine of both Adoniram's second and third wives. In 1815, a 10-year-old American girl, Sarah Hall, wept when she heard the death of Anne's baby Roger. She wrote a poem to mark the sad event. Little did she know that 18 years later she would become the second Mrs. Judson, and in 1828, a 12-year-old factory girl, Emily Shuckbuck, was similarly moved by Maria's death. Emily later wrote, "One day I took up a little dingy, coarse newspaper, and my eyes fell on the words, 'Little Maria lies by the side of her mother.' I had read about the missionaries. I knew therefore at once that the letter was from Mr. Judson, and that his little daughter was dead. How I pitied his loneliness. 18 years later she was to become the third Mrs. Judson. Emily said to a friend before ever meeting Mr. Judson, 'I have felt, ever since I read the memoir of Mrs. Anne H. Judson, when I was a small child, that I must become a missionary.'" In some ways, indeed, Anne seemed superhuman. Her courage in leaving America, her dedication in insisting that her beloved husband remain with the young believers while she had to seek medical help abroad, above all her loyalty during the imprisonment of Adoniram, and her disregard of risk to herself in the efforts on his behalf, inspire our admiration. The Lord undoubtedly gave Anne unusual gifts in terms of linguistic ability, determination and bravery, as well as spiritual gifts of zeal for souls, patience in working with inquirers, and faith during times of desperate hardship. And yet she was only too human in that she suffered as intensely as any of the world would suffer. She was not hard or insensitive or cold. It was her passionate devotion to her husband that enabled her to persevere on his behalf during his imprisonment. But the depth of her love for him meant that witnessing him in such degrading, sordid circumstances was daily torture for her. During her illness, when she was unable to nurse her baby, she was far more in agony for the plight of her hungry infant than mindful of her own pain. She was a woman who loved intensely, loved her husband, loved her children, loved the people of Burma, but above all, loved God. Appendix 2. Address to females in America relative to the situation of heathen females in the East. In the land of my birth, rendered doubly dear for the long entertained thought of never again beholding it, in the country favored by heaven above most others, it is with no common sensation I address my sisters and female friends on this most interesting subject. Favored as we are from infancy with instruction of every kind, used as we are to view the female mind in its proper state, and accustomed as we are to feel happy effect of female influence, our thoughts would fain turn away from the melancholy subject of female degradation, of female wretchedness. But will our feelings of pity and compassion, will those feelings which alone render the female character lovely, allow us to turn away, to dismiss the subject altogether without making an effort to rescue or to save? No, I think I hear your united voices echo the reply. Our efforts shall be joined with yours. Show us the situation of our tawny sisters, the other side of the world, and though the disgusting picture breaks our hearts, it will fill us with gratitude to Him who has made us to differ and excite to stronger exertion in their behalf. Listen, then, to my tale of woe. In Bengal and Hindostan, the females in the higher classes are excluded from the society of men. At the age of 2 or 3 years, they are married by their parents to children of their own rank in society. On these occasions all the parade and splendor possible are exhibited. They are then conducted to their father's abode, not to be educated, not to prepare for the performance of duties incumbent on wives and mothers, but to drag out the usual period allotted in listless idleness, in mental torpor. At the age of 13, 14, or 15, they are demanded by their husbands to whose house they are removed, where again confinement is their lot. No social intercourse is allowed to cheer their glooming hours, nor have they any consolation of feelings that they are viewed, even by their husbands, in the light of companions. So far from receiving those delicate attentions which render happy the conjugal state, and which distinguish civilization from heathen nations, the wife receives the appellation of my servant or my dog, and is allowed to partake of what her lordly husband is pleased to give at the conclusion of his repast. In this secluded, degraded situation, females in India receive no instruction, consequently they are wholly uninformed of an eternal state. No wonder mothers consider female existence a curse. Hence their desire to destroy their female offspring, and to burn themselves with the bodies of their deceased husbands. This last circumstance might imply some attachment, were it not a well-known fact that the disgrace of a woman who refuses to burn herself with the corpse of her husband is such that her nearest relation would refuse her a morsel of rice to prevent her starvation. Thus destitute of all enjoyment, both here and hereafter, are the females in Bengal. Such is their life, and such is their death. And here the scene is closed to mortal view. But they are amiable, say some, and destitute of those violent passions which are exhibited among females in our own country. My beloved friends, be not deceived. Whoever heard that ignorance was favorable to the culture of amiable feelings? Their minds are in such a state of imbecility that we might hope to find at least an absence of vicious feelings, but facts prove the contrary. Whenever an opportunity for exhibiting the malignant passions of the soul occurs, human nature never made a more vigorous effort to discover her odious deformity than has been observed in these secluded females. But let us turn our eyes from the present picture to one not less heartrending, but where hope may have a greater influence to brighten and to cheer. The females in the Burman Empire, containing a population far above the United States of America, are not like the females in Bengal, secluded from all society. In this respect, they are on an equality with ourselves. Wives are allowed the privilege of eating with their husbands. They engage in domestic concerns, and thus, in some respect, the Burman females deserve our particular sympathy and attention. But they enjoy little of the confidence or affection of their husbands, and to be born a female is universally considered a peculiar misfortune. The wife and grown daughters are considered by the husband and father as much the subject of discipline as younger children. Hence it is no uncommon thing for females of every age and description to suffer under the tyrannic rod of those who should be their protectors. Burma also, like her sister nation, suffers the female mind to remain in its native state, without an effort to show how much more highly she has been favored. The females of this country are lively, inquisitive, strong, and energetic, susceptible of friendship and the warmest attachment, and possess minds naturally capable of rising to the high estate of the cultivation and refinement. But alas, they are taught nothing that has a tendency to cherish these best native feelings of the heart. That they possess strong, energetic minds is evident from their mode of conversing, and from the inquisitive turn which is so conspicuous. It may not, perhaps, be uninteresting to mention a particular display of mental energy as exhibited in the early inquiries of Ma Menla. Some time previous to our arrival in Rangoon, her active mind was led to inquire the origin of all things. If a Buddh was deity, who created all that her eyes beheld? She inquired of this person and that, visited all the teachers within the circle of her acquaintance, but none were able to give her satisfactory information on the subject. Her anxiety increased to such a degree that her own family feared she would be deranged. She finally resolved on learning to read, that she might be able to gain the desired information from a sacred book. Her husband, willing to gratify her curiosity in this respect, taught her to read himself. After having acquired what very few Burman females were allowed to acquire, she studied the sacred books, which left her mind in the same inquisitive state as when she commenced. For 10 years she continued to inquire, when one day a neighbor brought in a tract written by Mr. Judson, from which she derived her first ideas of an eternal God. Her next difficulty arose from her being ignorant of the residence of the author of that tract, and it was not till after the erection of the Ziyat that this difficulty was removed. By her inquiries respecting the Christian religion, she evinced a mind which, had it been early and properly cultivated, would have hardly been surpassed by females in our own country. And happy am I to add that she not only became rationally speculatively convinced of the truth of the gospel, but was, I trust, taught to feel the power of her heart by the influence of the Holy Spirit, embraced them, has become an ornament of her profession, and her daily walk and conversation would shame many professors of religion in Christian countries. Shall we, my beloved friends, suffer minds like these to lie dormant, to wither in ignorance and delusion, to grope their way to eternal ruin without an effort on our part to raise and refine, to elevate and to point to that Savior who has died equally for them as for us? Shall we sit down to indolence and ease, indulge in all the luxuries with which we are surrounded, and which our country so bountifully affords, and leave beings like these, flesh and blood, intellect and feeling, like ourselves, and on our own sex to perish, to sink into eternal misery? No, by all the tender feelings of which the female mind is susceptible, by all the privileges and blessings resulting from the cultivation and expansion of the human mind, by our duty to God and our fellow creatures, and by the blood and groans of him who died on Calvary, let us make a unified effort. Let us call on all, old and young, in the circle of our acquaintance to join us in attempting to meliorate the situation, to instruct, to enlighten, to save females in the Eastern world. And though time and circumstance should prove that our united exertions have been ineffectual, we shall escape at death that bitter thought, that vermin females have been lost without an effort of ours to prevent their ruin. Anne H. Judson. Appendix 3. Biographical sketch of Adoniram Judson, 1788 to 1850. Adoniram never wrote a full autobiography. During a period of deep depression after the death of Anne, he ordered that all his private papers and letters be destroyed. Many records had in any case been burned by Anne during the ordeal of Ava during the Anglo-Burman War, and others were consumed in a house fire in Moulmein in 1847, but Adoniram did prepare a 7-page autobiographical record of dates and events before he died, which was included as an appendix to the biography compiled by his son, published in 1883. The facts in the following account are taken from this source. Early years of 1788 to 1808. Adoniram Judson, Sr., was vastly ambitious for his first-born son. He was himself a congregational minister, but he cherished high hopes that his eldest son would achieve great status. The character of the younger Adoniram was incredibly affected by his father's aspirations. Burning ambition and total determination were to characterize his life. Ultimately, these characteristics were to be focused on the evangelization of Burma. Born in Malden, Massachusetts on August 9th of 1788, Adoniram Jr. certainly exhibited those natural gifts which fueled his father's ambitions. A brilliant youngster, he excelled in everything he did. He also rebelled against his parents' faith. At the age of 16, he was sent a year early to Providence College, later called Brown University. Here he was captivated by the daring of those students who professed to be free thinkers and atheists. One of the leaders among these students was a powerful personality called Jacob Ames, who scoffed at everything that Adoniram had been brought up to value. Adoniram graduated in 1807, having achieved the highest place in his year. Aged 19, he returned home to teach school, and during his first year of teaching, he had 2 textbooks published, one on grammar and one on arithmetic. Life at home seemed very boring, and he soon left to seek a more exciting way of life from parental restraint. His conversion in 1808. And then a remarkable coincidence led to a spiritual revolution. One night when Adoniram arrived at an inn, the only room left was next to this critically ill man. Throughout the night, Adoniram was aware of the dying man's groans. In the morning, he was devastated to learn that the dead man was his admired college mentor, Jacob Ames. Suddenly, the daring of free thought seemed pathetic, and where was Ames now? There was enough of Adoniram's upbringing left in him for him to be certain that after death comes judgment. He regarded this event as the voice of God, and it was the beginning of a road back to faith. Adoniram entered the Theological Institute at Andover, Massachusetts, in October of 1808, and was converted the very next month. He became a member of the Third Congregational Church in Plymouth in May of 1809. In June, he was offered, but declined a post as tutor at Brown University. Already he was crucifying his natural ambition. Then a book changed his life, when in September of 1809 he obtained a copy of the Star in the East by Buchanan. He was shaken to consider that at the time, apart from the missions in North America Indians, the American Church had not sent out any foreign missionaries, and yet the majority of the world's population was perishing. How could American Christians sleep the sleep of death? Several other young men at the seminary in Andover were thinking exactly the same way. A group of them covenanted together to serve overseas for life. The first American missions leave for Asia in 1812. On June 28th of 1810, 4 young men, Judson, Knott, Newell, and Mills, submitted a proposal to the General Association of Congressional Ministers, which would lead to the formation of America's first Protestant overseas missionary agency, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission. Judson records that exactly a month later, on July 28th, he commenced an acquaintance with Anne Hasseltine. He graduated with an M.A. from Brown University in September, and in January of 1811 he was sent to England for consultation with the London Missionary Society. Back in America, the America's Board of Commissioners appointed Judson, Knott, Newell, and Hall as their first missionaries on September 19, 1811. They would soon be joined by a 5th, Luther Rice. The missionaries sailed for the East in February of 1812, and by now Judson, Newell, and Knott had married, so they were accompanied by their wives. The Judsons are baptized on September 6 of 1812. On September 1st of 1812, having arrived in India, Judson announced to the secretary of the board his change of views on baptism. He and Anne were baptized by immersion in Calcutta on September 6th of 1812, followed by November 1st by Luther Rice. The 3 of them could no longer, in all honesty, receive support from the body which had sent them out. They resigned from the Congregational Church and sent letters back to the American Baptists offering themselves as Baptist missionaries. In view of the appalling slowness of communication, they knew that it would be years rather than months before they heard whether they had support or not. Due to ill health, Rice returned to America in March of 1813. He proved to be a brilliant advocate of missions amongst the Baptists. The American Baptists did indeed accept the Judsons as their first overseas missionaries. Newell, Knott, and Mills, still Congregationalists, continued for the moment in India. Within the next 6 years, each of them had either died or had to return to America because of ill health. Arrival in Burma on July 13th of 1813. After many alarms and delays, the Judsons finally arrived in Rangoon, Burma, on July 13th of 1813. The prospects seemed bleak. The government of Burma was a despotic tyranny, and the subjects of the Burmese king were not allowed to convert from Buddhism to any other religion. The British Baptists had begun a mission in Burma, but the work had been hard and slow. Felix Carey, son of William Carey, and others had begun some work on translation, but by 1812 all missionaries apart from Felix had left. There had been no conversions. Thus far there was no church. The year after the Judsons' arrival, Mrs. Carey and the children drowned on the way up to Ava, and Felix Carey resigned from mission work. 5 years later, Adoniram baptized the first convert. By August of 1822, 9 years after their arrival, 18 Burmese converts had been baptized. By that time, he had completed the translation of the New Testament into Burmese, together with a summary of the Old. Imprisonment from June 8th of 1824 to February 21st of 1826. All mission work was suspended when war broke out between the English and Burmese in 1824. The cause of the war was a series of disputes over British-controlled territory in northern India. The effect was that the few foreigners in Burma were all equally suspect as spies and traitors and were thrown into prison, there to suffer conditions of medieval brutality. The British took control of Rangoon in May of 1824, and the 2 missionary families were able to leave for British-controlled India. But by this time, the Judsons and Dr. Jonathan Price had moved to the capital, Ava. Adoniram and Jonathan were imprisoned, with all other foreigners, for the duration of the war, and Anne remained free and made every effort possible to mitigate the harshness of their conditions. Anne's death, October 24th of 1826. One of the terms of peace in February of 1826 was that foreign prisoners should be free to leave for British-controlled territory, if they so wished. Price decided to remain in Burmese government service, and the Judsons resolved to continue with the missions in part of the country controlled now by Britain. The site chosen for the British base in the southern area of the country was named Amherst. Here Anne, Adoniram, and the remaining converts from Rangoon set up a new mission, and here Anne died in October of 1826. Her health had been shattered by the privations suffered during the war. Her only surviving child, Maria, died exactly 6 months later. Adoniram was devastated, and he had suffered so much during the war that he had few emotional reserves left. He continued working even as he struggled through a black tunnel of depression and grief. He labored for years on translating, then revising the Bible in Burmese and compiling a grammar and a dictionary. He was a perfectionist and insisted on working from the original languages using the most up-to-date aids and tools available. A new mission at Moulmein, 1827. Adoniram also supervised the transfer of the mission from Amherst. It had become obvious that the site of Amherst was not so suited as British base as it had first seemed. The British Army transferred their headquarters to Moulmein, and large numbers of people of various nationalities were moving there. Many Burmese nationals chose to live under British rather than Burmese rule, and the town grew rapidly. It was clear that it would be a far more strategic place than Amherst for the mission to be based. The Burmese converts, two couples from America, the Boardmans and the Wades, and Adoniram moved from Amherst to Moulmein during 1827. Adoniram had to leave the graves of Anne and Maria at Amherst. He continued to grieve bitterly during the early years at Moulmein, going further and further in self-renunciation and withdrawing almost totally from any form of social life or recreation. But his iron determination ensured that work continued, and in 1829 he wrote The Golden Balance, a tract in Burmese, which proved enormously helpful in communicating with Buddhists. By now, Judson was able to think along the lines of the Burmese and communicate with concepts and ideas that were appropriate and comprehensible to them. He also completed his revision of his translation of the New Testament and the summary of the Old Testament. The next year, in 1830, he attempted a mission back into the territory still controlled by the Burmese king, moving to Prame, a town beyond Rangoon. Here he continued translation, but also attempted evangelization among the local people. In 1831, he returned to Moulmein. The translation of the Bible completed, January 31st, 1834. 21 years after his first arrival in Rangoon, Judson completed the translation of the whole Bible. He had arrived in Burma in July of 1813. He had completed his translation on January 31st of 1834. He then spent 6 years revising his work. The revised edition was published in 1840. He did not work alone. To begin with, there had been a pioneer language work and translation accomplished by the British missionaries Charter and Carey. Then Judson was helped for years by Maung Ko En, a Burmese convert, and he used many other Burmese assistants. Adoniram read widely in Burmese literature to furnish his mind as fully as possible with every nuance of the idiom of the language and thought. As soon as missionary colleagues were competent in the language, he would call on them to correct the translation, and he carefully weighed every suggestion. Wayland wrote, "The importance of his work to millions of immortal souls was ever present in his view. He had been called on by providence of God to unfold to a whole nation, in their own language, the revelation of the Most High. He considered it to be a momentous undertaking, and a heavy weight would be rested on his soul if a single idea in the Scriptures had been rendered obscurely in consequence of haste, impatience, negligence, or culpable ignorance on the part of the translator." A distinguished linguist in India judged, "We honor Wycliffe and Luther for their labors in their respective tongues, but what meed of praise is due to Judson for the translation of the Bible, perfect as a literary work in the language so foreign to him as the Burmese." Evangelism. It is an irony that the greater part of Adoniram's time was spent laboring in the study when that great love of his life was preaching. He was increasingly frustrated by a chronic lung complaint, whereby any exertion of his voice led to disastrous spitting of blood. Whenever opportunity arose due to a break in the translation work, and when his health allowed, Adoniram reveled in village evangelism. But one of his cherished convictions was that indigenous workers were ultimately far more effective than foreign missionaries, and he had the joy of training and using many native preachers and evangelists. The freedom to evangelize offered by British protection was exploited to the full. The native Burmese were in the main Buddhists, with a mindset powerfully fixed against the notion of an eternal God. There was a huge amount of intellectual groundwork to be done. Adoniram and Anne had spent hundreds of hours in detailed discussions with inquirers, patiently chipping away at the many preconceptions which inhibited their understanding of the Christian message. The Boardmans and the Karen people in 1828 to 1834. During the years following the war, the minority group of Karen people began to be reached. In March 1828, George and Sarah Boardman moved from Moulmein to Tavoy, the area inhabited by the Karen people. The Karen did not have centuries of Buddhist education and culture behind them. Their mindset was far more amenable to accepting the Christian gospel. The Boardmans proved to be tireless in village evangelism among the Karen, walking for miles in rough hill terrain. The premature death of George Boardman in 1831 through tuberculosis was a terrible blow to the mission. Judson had baptized the 100th Karen convert in September of 1833. Later, hundreds more than thousands were converted, churches planted, and native workers appointed. Marriage to Sarah Boardman, April 10th of 1834 through September 1st of 1845. George Boardman's young widow, Sarah, resisted all invitations to return to America. She was fluent in Burmese and Karen, and for 3 years she continued running a school, as well as engaging in evangelistic work. Adoniram had been deeply attached to both George and Sarah. They had helped him bury little Maria, and had comforted him after her death. Over the years, Adoniram's respect for their dedication and abilities had grown. Having completed the translation of the whole Bible in January of 1834, it is as if Adoniram now felt he could begin a new life. On April 1st, he left for Tavoy to see Sarah Boardman, and they were married on April 10th. 3 years had passed since George's death, 8 years since that of Anne. Adoniram and Sarah found great happiness together. Sarah was like Anne, a tireless co-worker. Once settled in Moulmein with Adoniram, having already mastered the Burmese and Karen languages, she set out to learn the Taling dialect. There was many Taling, Pengon, people in Moulmein, and thus far none of the missionaries had been able to minister to them in their own language. Sarah soon began, with the help of Pengon Christians, to translate tracts and the catechism. She also led prayer meetings and Bible classes. In addition, she gave Adoniram the family life he had never been able to enjoy with Anne. Children were born October 1835, April 1837, July 1838, December 1839, March 1841, this child was stillborn, July 1842, December of 1843, and December of 1844. While these little ones brought immense joy, there was also the ever-present specter of tropical sicknesses. Adoniram, Sarah, and the children all succumbed to serious illness. In 1841, the family traveled to Sedamapur to try to find respite, but there little Henry died, aged 1 year and 7 months. It seemed that others of the children might die also. Eventually, like Anne before her, Sarah was told that she would die unless she returned to America. Since she was too weak to travel alone, Adoniram and 3 older children sailed with her on April 26th of 1845. The 3 younger ones were left in Burma. Sarah deteriorated rapidly. They arrived at the island of St. Helena on August 26th, and she died on September 1st of 1845. Returned to America, 1845 to 1846. Adoniram arrived back in America on October 15th, exhausted, bereaved, and with the anxiety of having to find a home for Abby Ann, age 10, Adoniram, 8, and L. Nathan, 7. Many conflicting emotions must have been evoked by his return to the homeland he had left 33 years before. Of his own family, only his sister Abigail was left. His parents and brother were dead. America itself was transformed. The frontier had shifted westward, and the industrialization was leading in the creation of cities. The issue of slavery was dividing the states as if it were dividing the church. Adoniram and the others had left as mere youth, applauded by some, mocked by many. Now he arrived back to find himself a celebrity. The drama of the war years in Ava, the subsequent death of Anne and Maria, the tragic death of George Boardman, and heroic endeavors of his wife Sarah, the happy remarriage of Adoniram to Sarah, and finally Sarah's premature death, had been as near as the American public could wish to get a soap opera, but all the better for being true and so edifying. Adoniram was public property, and he hated it. Invitations to preach flooded in, but before he left Burma he had written to the board pleading that he should not be booked up. Since there are thousands of preachers in English, and only 5 or 6 Burmese preachers in the whole world, I may be allowed to hoard up the remnant of my breath and lungs for the country where they're most needed. His priorities were to get the children settled, find someone to write a suitable memoir of Sarah, and ensure continuing support for the Burman mission. The later was in grave doubt, the mission was in debt, and the issue of slavery had led to the formation of a separate Southern Baptist convention. Funds were in crisis, but despite his inability to engage in any public speaking due to the lung complaint, he managed to swing opinion behind expansion rather than retrenchment. In November, he left his 3 children with suitable families. A few days after the painful goodbyes, a letter arrived telling him that little Charlie, aged 1 year and 7 months, had died on August 5th of 1845 at Moulmein. 4 years before, he and Sarah had watched little Henry die, aged 1 and 7 months. The appalling memories and the loneliness must have seemed all but overwhelming. But then in January of 1846, Adoniram found the ideal biographer for Sarah, and in less than a month he proposed to marry her. It began when a minister friend gave him a popular book to while away some time during a delay on a journey. It was by a young woman, Emily Chubbuck, who wrote under the name of Fanny Forrester. All her work sparkled with a lively personality. When he found out that she was a committed Christian, Adoniram was immediately struck that this might be just the person to write Sarah's memoir. When he met Emily, he found that she was far from superficial. She had worked her way to success from a pitiful poor background. At the age of 11, she had been out working in a factory. Of that period, she later said, "My principal recollections during this summer are of noise and filth, bleeding hands, aching feet, and a very sad heart." Largely self-taught, she had turned to teach and writing in order to support her needy parents. As Fanny Forrester, Emily was highly thought of by literary critics, but she was also immensely religious, having been converted at the age of 8. As a young girl, she had been moved to the depths of her being by the account of the deaths of Anne and Maria Judson, and had sensed a nagging inward call to missionary work ever since. Returned to Burma with Emily in 1846. Adoniram and Emily met in January, they married in June, and left for Burma in July. Friends were dubious as to how the 29-year-old writer would adapt to the rigors of missionary life, but as with Anne and Sarah, Adoniram had chosen well. Each of his wives was enormously gifted in their own right. Emily confounded all the critics by learning the language in an extraordinarily short time, by cheerfully enduring some of the most miserable conditions even Adoniram had ever experienced, and by proving to be an exemplary mother to his surviving children. When Adoniram, now aged 58, and Emily arrived back in Moulmein at the end of November of 1846, they were not to know that he had only 4 years left. The mission at Moulmein in the area under British protection was prospering, and Adoniram longed that the gospel be taken once more into the territory still controlled by the Burmese king. He set off almost immediately with Emily and the 2 remaining little ones to Rangoon. They managed to hang on there for 6 months, Judson working on his dictionary and Emily on her memoir of Sarah. Conditions were atrocious, and the health of all the family gave way. The greater discouragement, however, was the news that the mission board had sent orders for retrenchment. Due to lack of funds, they were unable to finance the establishment of a mission in Burma proper. Adoniram accepted that the Lord was sovereignly overruling events, but he was bitterly disappointed at the seemingly lukewarmness of American Christians. The family was forced to move back to the mission base at Moulmein. In December of 1847, a little girl was born, named Emily Frances. 1848 was a happy year. Adoniram and Emily enjoyed each of the 3 little ones, Adoniram superintending the growing mission, Emily fluent enough in Burmese to teach a Bible class and lead a ladies' prayer meeting. In January of 1849, Adoniram completed his dictionary, but in 1849 both Adoniram and Emily were struck down with poor health. By March of 1850, Adoniram was told only a sea voyage might save his life. Emily was expecting another baby, and she would not be able to accompany him. She knew that Adoniram was dying, yet could not overrule the doctors who insisted that a voyage held out a slim chance for survival. Death on April 12 of 1850. The ship sailed on April 6, 1850. Adoniram died and was buried at sea just 6 days later. 10 days after that, Emily gave birth to their son Charles. He died at birth. Although Adoniram had died only a few hundred miles west of Burma, Emily had to wait 4 agonizing months before the news got back to Moulmein at the end of August. At first, she wanted to continue with mission work in Burma, but ill health forced her to return to America with the 3 children in 1851. She then helped Dr. Francis Wayland to write his definitive 2-volume biography of Adoniram. 3 years later, in 1854, she died of tuberculosis. The legacy. Anne and Adoniram Judson arrived in Burma in 1813. By the time of Adoniram's death in 1850, a strong church had been established among the Karen people. The translation of the Bible, the dictionary, the tracts, the catechism, all these had provided a firm foundation for future evangelization. Today, a very significant number of minority people groups in Burma are Baptist Christians. Overall, of the total population of 51 million, around 8.9% would profess to be Christian. But the minority people are looked down on by the main people group of Burma, which is overwhelmingly Buddhist. The central government has declared that to be Burmese is to be Buddhist, and in recent years, directives have been issued for the elimination of Christianity. Even in this unpromising context, the church maintains a strong missionary vision. The vision, nothing is difficult to omnipotence. Adoniram Judson's vision had not been confined to Burma. He longed for the evangelization of the whole world and prayed fervently for the churches in America to be mobilized to that end. Wayland noted, as Mr. Judson believed, that this was the work of God. One thing seemed to him just as easy as another. Nothing is difficult to omnipotence. The life ambition of Adoniram Judson was aptly expressed in his parting address to American Christians before his final return to Burma in 1846. The world is yet in its infancy. The gracious designs of God are yet hardly developed. Glorious things are spoken of Zion, the city of our God. She is yet to triumph and become the joy and glory of the whole earth. Blessed be God that will live in these latter times, the latter times of the region of darkness and imposture. Great is our privilege, precious our opportunity to cooperate with the Savior in the blessed work of enlarging and establishing his kingdom throughout the world. Let us not, then, regret the loss of those who have gone before us and are waiting to welcome us back home, nor shrink from the summons that must call us thither. Let us only resolve to follow them who, through faith and patience, inherit the promises. Let us so employ the remnant of life and so pass away that our successors will say of us, as we are our predecessors, blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. They rest from their labors, and their work do follow them.